This week we read chapter 6 in your textbook called Examining Relationships, and this chapter focuses on correlational designs, correlational analyses. So in this lecture, I'm going to go over correlational research, different types of correlational analyses, including chi-square, Pearson's R, simple regression, multiple regression, and I'm also going to talk about mediation and moderation. I know that there was a lot in this chapter, and there's probably a lot that you don't quite understand, and that's okay. I'm going to explain everything that you need to know in this lecture, and there's certainly some material in the chapter that you don't need to know. So whatever I don't explain and whatever is not covered in the homework, you don't have to worry about it. Correlational research examines the relationship between at least two continuous variables. Remember, there are continuous or categorical variables. That's not right. There are continuous and numerical variables, as well as discrete categorical variables. So we're looking at numerical, measured on a scale, and this is also where Likert type data could be used here as well. When we were reviewing experimental research in chapter 5, we talked about independent variables and dependent variables, which is really about looking at cause and effect, which you can do in an experimental study or a longitudinal study, but you can't really look at cause and effect in a correlational study. So because of that, we're going to call these variables predictor variables and criterion variables. So predictor is the variable that you think will predict any change in the criterion variable. So any possible influences or factors on a particular phenomenon that you are interested in. In correlational research, the assumption is that the relationship between the variables is linear. What that means is that there is a direct and consistent relationship between the two of them. So for example, if you were to plot all of the values or data points that you got from participants onto a graph, you should more or less be able to draw a straight line through all of the data points. It doesn't mean that they would all fall in a straight line, but that they would gather around a straight line. Before we get into different types of correlational analyses, I do want to talk about the chi-square test. Even though this chapter is about correlational analyses, and correlational analyses are between continuous variables, they included the chi-square analysis. However, the chi-square analysis tests for a relationship between two categorical variables. So all the chi-square does is tell you that there is a difference among the categories. It doesn't tell you how strong the difference is, which is something that a correlational analysis will tell you. So if you look at the example on the slide, let's say you surveyed 170 high school students and you asked whether they identified as Catholic or Protestant, and you asked if they were interested in going to college or not interested in going to college. You then have two different categorical variables, religion and their interest in college. So the chi-square, it would test to see if the differences between those four boxes was significant. And in this example, it was significant. And it was significant in the sense that Catholic teens were less likely to show an interest in attending college than Protestant teens. I didn't make up this example, by the way. I stole it. It's a strange example, but gets the point across. So the most common way that we discuss correlation is through Pearson's R. Although this is the most simple form of correlation, and there are many more complicated forms of correlation, this is what we're normally talking about when we say two variables are correlated. So Pearson's R is an analysis that tests for a relationship between two continuous variables. It doesn't talk about prediction. It's really just asking the question, do these variables change together? And what you can do is test for the strength of that relationship and the direction of that relationship. And what I mean by that is, from strength, you're looking at from 0 to 1. The values of Pearson's R can range from 0 to 1. The closer it is to 1, the more strongly those two variables are related. And if it's 0, there is absolutely no relationship between the variables. Now, the relationship can be positive or negative. So in a positive correlation, every time one variable goes up in value, the other variable goes up in value. Whereas in a negative relationship, if one variable goes up, the other variable goes down. So you may think that if you had a small r value, like 0.1 or 0.2, that it's not a strong relationship, and so it wouldn't be significant. But you have to always look at the p-value, which will be reported with the r statistic, and that will tell you whether or not the relationship is significant. And what that r value tells you is really the effect or the strength of that relationship. So how correlated are they? They could still move together, it's just not a very strong relationship. At the bottom you have an example of what correlation results reported in a study would look like. So here they might say the two variables were strongly correlated. You see you have the R test statistic there. That tells you that this is a Pearson's R. And we see 0.49, which is the R statistic or the R coefficient. So that tells us it's around 0.5, the correlation there. And the p-value is less than 0.01, so it is significant. So what that really means with that point, let's round up to about 0.5, is you're looking at the slope of the line that would connect all of the dots and all of the values. So earlier when I said if you plotted all of the data points on a graph and they have a linear relationship, you should be able to draw a line through most of those points. So the slope of that line tells us how steep it is. And so this line would be about 0.5, so it would almost be at like a 45-degree angle, meaning that every time one variable goes up by 1, the other variable will go up by half. For example, if, let's say, we're measuring, this is a silly example, I'm at home with Nelson right now, so I'm thinking about my dog. Let's say we're measuring how much you increase a dog's food intake and then how much weight that they gain. A 0.5 relationship would say that for every cup of food you add each day, the dog gains half a pound. A 1-to-1 correlation, so R equals 1, would mean that for every cup of food every extra cup of food you feed the dog gains a pound. So a simple regression also uses a correlational analysis, but the intention here is to predict. So this tests if one continuous variable predicts another. So it also looks at slope, just like correlation does, but it also looks at the intercept, which you don't need to know, but it takes it a step further, and we're looking at prediction. Does one continuous variable predict another? And you can see at the bottom, I've given you an example of what those results would look like in a study. So here, social support significantly predicted depression scores, and you have the beta there, the slope of the line, the t-test, so using a t-test to tell if that's a significant difference. We see with the p-value it is less than 0.001. And then it says social support also explained a significant proportion of variance in depression scores, and that gives you r squared equals 0.12. So with regression and with a lot of these correlational analyses, we don't just want to know if social support predicts depression, we also want to know how much of depression it predicts. how strong is that relationship? Or in other words, what is the effect size? What is the effect of social support on depression? Because they can be significantly related, but that doesn't mean that social support is the only thing that predicts depression. So the R-squared value tells us how much variance in depression is accounted for by social support. So here we have R-squared equals 0.12. That's the effect size. That tells us how much variance is accounted. I'm not going to tell you what that means exactly because that's part of your homework. But the answer is on the slide. Multiple regression tests if two or more continuous variables predict another. So it's like simple regression, except that we have at least two predictors. Still only one criterion variable, so only one outcome that we're interested in. And when you do multiple regression, you have to report whether the model is significant. So do these predictors actually predict the criterion? And then also you have to report the relationship between each predictor and the criterion. So you have to break it down between each predictor variable. So in the sample here, they talk about testing whether personality traits significantly predicted aggression. And the analysis indicated that these two predictors, so these two personality traits, predicted 35.8% of the variance in aggression. And then they broke it down and found that extroversion significantly predicted aggressive tendencies with a beta value of 0.56, and agreeableness also predicted aggressive tendencies with a beta value of negative 0.36. It is possible for your multiple regression model to be significant, and not every predictor predicts the criterion, which is why it's important to report every single result. Your chapter did talk about multicollinearity as well, which is basically means you want to avoid using very similar predictors. Because if your predictors are very similar, then they're going to be measuring the same thing, and you can't really analyze if multiple predictors are predicting the same criterion when they're all the same predictors, right? So here in this example of personality traits, we have a personality trait of extroversion and a personality trait of agreeableness. And so we can assume in this study that they made sure that extroversion and agreeableness were not highly correlated themselves to the point where they almost measure the same thing. And just by looking at it, extroversion and agreeableness, we can guess that they're not necessarily the same thing. However, if they were measuring a variable called agreeableness and another variable called friendliness, those two predictors might be too similar, in which case they're measuring the same thing and the analysis wouldn't work. So multiple regression is when you hypothesize that there are multiple different variables that might all influence one outcome. The chapter also talked about mediation and moderation models, which sometimes can be difficult to understand the difference between the two. So I have two examples here for you from Elon Meyer's minority stress model that I hope will clear that up. So a mediator explains the relationship between the predictor and the criterion variable. Tells you kind of like the how or the why that one affects the other. Whereas a moderator influences the strength of the relationship between the two. So the example here with mediation, research consistently shows that individuals with minority identity, and in this example we're talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual folks, have higher rates of mental health issues. So in the past, this relationship has been used to make a case for classifying homosexuality as a mental disorder, for arguing that a non-heterosexual orientation was unhealthy or harmful for people. However, in 2003, Elon Meyer, a personal and professional hero of mine, proposed the minority stress model, which incorporated numerous studies on stress processes in LGBT people And in that paper, Meyer suggested that the relationship between a minority identity and mental health outcomes was mediated by minority stress. So that is, without the presence of prejudice, discrimination, and stigma, LGBT people would have the same mental health outcomes as their straight counterparts. So here, minority stress explains why a minority identity predicts negative mental health outcomes. Now, in the moderation example, moderation is about the strength of the relationship between the predictor and the criterion. So in this example, so this is actually part of the minority stress model that Meyer proposed. In his model, minority stress processes, such as experiencing violence or discrimination, expecting to be rejected, concealing your identity, and internalizing stigma, affect mental health outcomes. And most commonly measured outcomes in this case are usually depression, substance use, anxiety, suicidality. However, the relationship between minority identity and mental health is moderated by the coping and social support of each individual, meaning that coping and social support changes the strength of the relationship between minority stress and mental health. So that relationship exists between minority stress and mental health, but it is moderated by coping and social support, meaning the strength of that relationship changes depending on how much coping and social support each person has. So in plain language, if someone has high coping and social support, minority stress may have less of an effect on their mental health. But if somebody has low coping and social support, their experiences of minority stress may have a stronger impact on their mental health. Put another way, two people could experience the same discrimination and rejection, but if one person has a lot of coping skills, resiliency, social support, and the other person doesn't, the one who doesn't have those resources is more likely to have negative mental health outcomes as a result of those minority stress experiences. That is it for this lecture. These are the most essential pieces from the chapter. I want to make sure you understand that a chi-square tests for differences among categorical variables, that the basic correlational analyses are Pearson's R, simple regression, and multiple regression, and that you know the difference between mediation and moderation. On Blackboard, you will also find a homework practice assignment that you can complete in groups, and this will also help you prepare and study for the midterm exam. And as always, if you have any questions, please let me know.